right. Well, welcome to the Güero y Latina podcast. And as you can tell, this is not a Latina sitting next to me. We are absent my wife today. But hey, if you're going to bring in somebody who, when you can't have a sharp mind like my wife here, who better to bring in than Counselor Stephen Casey, attorney at law, who I've known for many years. He's a great lawyer. But even more exciting to me than that, he's just a Christian I admire who does his best every day to live out his faith, both in his practice and in his family and every other part of his life. So, Stephen, welcome to the podcast. And if you're wondering what in the heck are they going to talk about today? Well, today we are talking about the most recent Supreme Court decision just came down last week, the week of our 250th Soldiers of Independence. I think that is the timing of that is fascinating to me because we all celebrated that with gusto here in the previous weekend. And this decision goes all the way back to our founding and before. It's one of the more interesting decisions because it's so steeped in history and the common law and precedent, other decisions. So fascinating. And I think as believers, this podcast is the intersection of faith, law, immigration, and leadership. And so this kind of touches at least on three of those. Faith, law, and faith, law, and immigration. So we're gonna have a great time, I think, talking about today. Stephen, welcome.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I'm looking forward to it. Appreciate you bringing me on here. I do love those topics. I think they all intersect, and we have to make sure we start off for those at the right spot. And I think faith drives it all.
And I was going to give a little bit of an introduction, but tell us a little about your practice, just briefly. What you've been doing the last? You've been a lawyer for 2 decades, a little over, I think.
Just right at. I was licensed in 2008.
Okay. And although you are not a practicing immigration lawyer, this is an area of interest to you. He's one of the few guests I've ever had. Look at this guy. He comes prepared. I know he spoke at a conference, a legal conference a couple of years ago that was discussing this very concept, this idea of faith and law, and especially the concept of immigration. So just tell us a little about your background and why is this important to you?
Yeah. So I started off Navy engineering for 8 years, and God called me to more. I got more technically astute into managing people and concerned about people, the issues that matter to them, the serious things of our lives. I exited the Navy, spent 8 years, my undergrad, double major in biblical studies and history and political science. So I really like the contours, the landscape, of how those interact.
Yeah, this decision was right up your alley then. Has all of those there.
It was perfect. And after that, I still felt the call to go to seminary. So I went to seminary before I went to law school. I thought that was a foundation for me to understand the law, to dive into it with the right first principles. And I think this decision provides a wonderful opportunity to examine those first principles to make sure that how we live our lives out reflect how God wants our lives to be lived out in accordance with his eternal law, the law, what he's revealed to us as Christians, and the way the natural law plays out, which affects our lives daily, particularly when governs past constitutions and statutes that all have to be subservient to those larger umbrellas.
Absolutely. And when just at the current moment you're currently practicing, what is your area of practice? Right?
So I'm civil and family law at the trial level and appeals from those decisions.
There you go. Okay. Well, let's just dive right into it. We try to keep this conversation somewhat casual because we don't want to get too deep and nerdy in the law and lose everybody. But let's just address your first thoughts on the decisions that came down. Anything you want to just throw out there, your first thoughts?
Yeah, I thought there's a dissonance there. There's two different things they're trying to reconcile, because most of the common law that we brought from England, that is the foundation of 49 out of the 50 states, Louisiana resting itself from the Napoleonic Code. The assumption is that it's going to line up. It's going to cohere. It's going to have an internal coherence and correspond to what we see in reality. And I thought that was the biggest conflict throughout the opinion. Two of the principles that I think are countering each other is the common law principle that a child cannot consent to anything. Consent is always through the parents. The family, I think the Bible tells us, shows us that the family is the pre-government unit of our society, parents and children. And that the child, because they are under the authority of the parent, can never consent to anything until they're 18. So the majority decision in the Supreme Court case brings that in, but yet says that we're inheriting this birthright citizenship from the English common law. The conflict with that is, again, a child cannot consent to anything. And the Declaration of Independence is a watershed. Prior to the Declaration, and you can track this across all the governments in the world that exist right now, the vast majority of them, which have some sort of self-determination, use our declaration as a model, because the world as a whole moved from feudalism, where you owed your allegiance, your political allegiance, to the king because you were born on his soil. So it was an automatic right that that king or queen or monarchy possessed, or that warlord, whoever it was, possessed because you were born on their soil. And the Declaration was a watershed. It said, after this, we're no longer doing that. It pulled from English philosophers like John Locke, who said the people that are in government owe their governmental power to a phrase, the consent of the governed. It's always by consent.
Mm-hmm.
And so to go back and say that the consent of that child is withdrawn, it's automatic before the parents even get to make a decision.
Yeah.
That to me injects the government into the crib, into that parent-child relationship. It's no longer a two-part relationship or a call it dyad. It's a triad right now, a three-part relationship where the government is now involved from the moment of birth, and you don't get a decision in that. And that's problematic to me, from the idea of family and the parents are pre-governmental ended.
So in case you've been living under a rock and you're like, what are these guys talking about? So the Supreme Court got this case kind of in a rare way. Usually cases get litigated, they get filed at the district court level, sometimes even lower, it can be in the states level, and they work their way up to the courts of appeals and whatnot. And there's a whole process that we were talking before the podcast started about. There's a record that kind of gets created. In this case, it was so unique because the president issued executive order saying, he basically said, I don't want anybody to get birth certificates issued anymore if they're born here, unless if they're not legally here. Trying to make a distinction between people who are born here who are children of citizens or permanent residents, or maybe just people here lawfully under visas, and those who either entered without inspection or perhaps overstayed visas, which you can imagine that would become quite a complication for hospitals if they're having to get into the documentation of, I mean, it's one thing if say, are you a citizen or not? It's another thing like, well, was your visa? Did you come in legally? Is it still active? Do you have a pending change of status? It can get very complicated even for lawyers. So, so he files this and immediately it just kind of gets sucked up into the Supreme Court right out of the gate. And they said, we're willing to take this on. So did you find anything unique about that or strange about that?
I think that posture is a little bit unusual. It started off with a few courts issuing nationwide injunctions. And those were unique because it went up to the Supreme Court right away. And the Supreme Court was actually in favor of the administration that said a unique court in a certain jurisdiction, let's say where we are, the Western District of Texas, cannot issue an injunction that goes outside the bounds of that district to the entire nation. So then it went back down, and then other courts were.
Which is actually a separate issue that they were trying to address, which is this habit that's been a bad problem for a while now of one district judge, and that it could be in Hawaii or in Alaska, controlling the law for,
all 50 states, right?
And that is a challenge.
It was. So then it went back up, and they said so important that we make the decision on it at a preliminary injunction level. And mind you, that process in the lawsuit for your listeners, viewers, is at the very beginning. All you know is what one side has alleged and the other side has responded. There's no evidence. There's no experts. There's no people testifying. It's just an injunction hearing. And that injunction was granted. And so it went up immediately to the U.S. Supreme Court because the administration said, this is so important. We want you to address this right away. So it's not a complete case. And that's problematic whenever you're going to litigate a case, because you just don't have enough evidence.
Yeah. So, and so anyways, I'm going to do my best to kind of in a layman's terms frame this. You had two camps essentially, and I got very fresh. I was so satisfied to read the decision because in my lead up to this, when I would listen to people talk about it, it was shocking to me how many people just wanted to frame this through a lens of 2026. And
Sure.
There's, of course, you hear people talk all the time about being originalist, that we should interpret the Constitution how it was written and intended by the authors at the time, whether in the Bill of Rights, the various amendments, and that we shouldn't change that. But and here I saw conservatives almost taking a different slant on that, although they were still trying to say, well, that's not what they intended. But they were saying that very much with the mindset of what they were seeing on the ground today with immigration, as in, look what it's allowing. And they would have never allowed that. Of course, 250 and more years ago, they wanted immigrants. If anything, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson, they complain about the fact that His Majesty was not letting people immigrate, and they were trying to block immigration. So I go back every year and I reread the Declaration. I forgot that was one of the grievances listed in there. It's like, hey, he's keeping people from coming here that we want. So
Sure.
So it's interesting. You have this all sorts of dangers of revisionism, and that's always the challenge. Usually, that's the battle cry of the originalist: is you can't go back and reinterpret. And of course, you see that most famously, I think, or easiest to understand with the Second Amendment, because the argument clearly is like, well, back in that day, you needed a militia because there were roving bands of Indians and other groups, and you need to have people come together for their own security. We didn't have the ability. We didn't have police forces and all this. So, but now look at us. We don't have to need for guns. You just call 911. And so there's this deep debate of like, well, but the point still is the same, which is, it's a protection. Yeah, it could be a protection against, not so much against Indians anymore, but obviously criminals or other parameters of my heart. But what about that issue of tyranny? What about that issue of, could you ever need that weapon against somebody who's trying to oppress you? And that oppressor could potentially be your government. We don't like to talk about that because it sounds loony in 2026, but that truth still exists out there. And it doesn't take that long of a glance across borders to see down even to Mexico, where they have very restrictive firearm policies.
Mm-hmm.
And who benefits from that the most?
The outlaws.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyways, I don't get too far off in the woods here, but so this friend really quickly is the question of that policy, if really truly intended by the authors of that, is causing so much problems now, and how could they have intended that?
Yeah, I think of it like in that family parlor living room game Twister.
Yeah.
Where you start off and everybody's got their hands on one dot or another, and then as time goes by, they get all intertangled and intertwined, and ultimately, the goal of the game is someone falls down and someone collapses. And I think that directly speaks to our policy. When we go so far from where we should have been that things are problematic, you're just one decision away from collapsing a structural framework. And immigration, it didn't used to mean a lot to me because it wasn't affecting my daily life. But I'm married to my wife's half Filipino.
Mm-hmm.
My father-in-law married my mother-in-law in the Philippines. Under the laws at the time, once they were married, my distant in-laws, my wife's uncles from the Philippines, they thought they were very excited. They said, well, we have someone who's married. We're going to move to Toronto and we're going to be on the short list to immigrate to the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Under the laws at the time, that made sense to them. And they waited for 20 years until they could move.
Yeah.
And once they got the go ahead, and that was after, and this to my mind about the image of God, and we eventually touch on that. People kept coming in front of them, famous people with a lot of money, scientists, sports figures, politically connected people. And after 20 years in Toronto, whenever they finally got the go ahead, they said, we even embedded our lives here in Toronto. Why move? And so,
yeah,
it really.
How old were they when they first got into line, and how old were they 20 years later?
They were in their mid 30s, 40s, and then they're in their 60s, 70s whenever they got the go ahead.
Which is a fascinating. I mean, we're going to get to the tail end of this. We're talking a little about policy. This idea that generally you want people here and their breadwinning earning days, because they're taxpayers, they're buyers, they're consumers. It's common. It's good for it to be common. Yeah. It's good capitalism. The worst time to bring in somebody is at the tail, not the 50s, your tail in your life, but the older you get, you're going to spend less. Become more conservative, and you become more expensive because of healthcare.
Yes.
So that always frustrates me that we have policies that
it was tough.
Let's not bring in these productive earners.
That's right.
Let's put them in the shelf for 20 years.
And because of all the machinations of policy, they never went back to original first principles, and I would say original biblical principles, and bring it forward. So you have all these errors carried forward. If you use a tool like a hammer that's got a defect on the face of the hammer and you're trying to pound something out flat, you're always going to have those imperfections left in what you're trying to make very flat. And so every time they tried to approach policy, because they didn't have a good understanding of the image of God, because they didn't have a good understanding of what the declaration meant, they were bound to have those problems just carried forward the whole time and never be able to kind of cleanse themselves and get back to what I would believe would be the original first principles. Because if we do that, people naturally receive what God has done in a good way. And yeah, as human beings, the more our statutory laws butt heads with natural law and butt heads with God's eternal law, those are going to be the pressure points of our society. And we see it right now.
Well, and believers, obviously we believe, as the scripture tells us, that God has written his law in our heart. And so that means there's people, even if you never picked up the Bible or you didn't pay attention in church or Sunday school, or you got very limited knowledge of what's in the Bible, you do have a common understanding of what God would say is fair and just.
Yes.
Even if you're a selfish person,
Mhm.
I think even the selfish people or narcissists can realize, well, I understand why if there's a line,
Mhm.
somebody shouldn't get to cut to the front, right? That's just a basic thing. We learn it in school when we're all waiting for a water fountain or whatnot.
Absolutely.
So, but anyways, back to, because I love how we're gonna weave all this in all throughout this conversation, what God's word and God, the Creator, would have us do. But so go into this. I thought it was fascinating too, going back to the decision. So it's Trump v. Barber. If you want to look it up, I should have said that from the beginning. That's the title, the styling of it. It all came down to this argument about the 14th Amendment, and which was passed right after the Civil War, and whether or not that really meant to include everybody under, or if it was just about the slaves who had just been freed a few years earlier. And what always bothered me about the framing of that, although I understand why that is, because before there was just very little, I mean, I'm not going to say nothing, but there not a whole lot touched on that about what is a city. I mean, if you think about it, it's crazy that you would create a country, out of nothing. And in the founding original constitution, the documents, nobody said, well, who is a citizen?
Mhm.
Like, you think that would be like, who's one of us? And underwritten in that is this assumption it's clearly it's not that they didn't think about it. They had elections. So people were voting. Who's going to vote? Citizens. So how did they know who was a citizen? And they had underpinning assumptions, and obviously that came from somewhere. And it always bothered me to start off with, like, well, the 14th Amendment, and I understand why.
Mhm.
But we had, I mean, the 14th Amendment was passed in 66 or 60, I can't
It
remember.
was 65 after the
Civil War, right? So you're, 4 and 7 years, right? So you're at 87 plus. I think that's 3 years later. So you're at 90 years into this experiment, the grand experiment of our democratic republic. And they'd already been acknowledging citizens for that period. That to me seems, tell me what your thought is that, because I'm always caught up by the lawyer when we've been doing something for a long period of time as lawyers, because we're following the law, we're following precedent, we're following practice. There's what the principle there, that we have in law, it's referred to sometimes as stare decisis. I promised myself I wouldn't try to throw out any fancy Latin words here, but this idea that we're going to try to keep things the same unless we have a radical reinterpretation needed because people were abusing. We understand that there is the occasion, obviously Brown v. Board of Education or some of these others, like what is separate and equal, that you have to have people come and say, well, hold on, y'all were abusing this principle. So it's not so you can't ever do it, but for the most part, it's a big deal when you upend decades and decades of practice. So they were up, that by the time you get around to passing the 14th Amendment, there have been 90 years. And it just bothered me that nobody wanted to act like that was unimportant, how they were doing things. But let me tell me your thoughts on that.
I think at the beginning, they understood the seriousness and the implications of everything the Declaration stood for. There really was a question. Now, in order to, I look at citizenship as a marriage. Like, if I want to speak into the life of a woman, my wife, and I've got to have some sort of covenant with her.
I was about to say, you're saying because of a covenant.
Yeah, covenant. So I'm going to covenant with you, and you're going to covenant with me. I'll give an example of how we're why I believe that so strongly. In college, I did a course on Central African history, tracked the status of the Dutch wars who were in South Africa. The British came in, kicked them north where they went to Central Africa, and what they find? A bunch of gold and diamonds. So they had tons of British guest workers in the Central Africa and the two countries that it made. And it was just assumed that it was a Dutch country, so we were going to follow Dutch laws. And England, being the bully of the moment, said, you give all of those all those English workers who are not Dutch citizens, you give them the right to vote. Now we're going to invade. And so immediately they gave them the right to vote, and they voted to become a British country.
Yeah, that's one way to naturalize.
So it seemed that there was never a consent base right there. It was just by force. Right?
Yeah, or threat. Yeah, that's
By
right.
threat. And so to me, if it's the marriage, having the way they decide it is that, my wife, she's 9 months pregnant, has a baby there, right? That would be the political equivalent of a casual encounter, or like a one night stand, if you will. That's just not, there's no long-term view of it.
Mm-hmm.
There's no covenant there. It's benefits without duties, responsibilities. And so it doesn't seem to be the idea of a marriage, a long-term, I want your values, you want my values, we're going to form something together to be long-term. And there are a lot of spin-off implications of that when you see what is required and expected of a citizen.
Now, what you're saying here tracks a little bit with what the government position was, which is there's this element of fealty. And that was their biggest problem, is that they were saying, people who are not here legally owe their fealty to another sovereign.
Yeah.
And of course, they got into this whole thing of domicile. That became a big thing too.
Yes.
So whether somebody's just passing through a country or if they're actually living there. But I love the way you say that, because that is true. When you naturalize, what do? You have to go through a ceremony. So what do? You swear.
You swear.
So much like a wedding,
That's
just
right.
like you're right. I never thought of it that way until you just said that. So that's interesting. There is an element you're now making a conscious decision. I'm committing to this.
Yeah, it's a red. What I love the beauty about it, I heard a comedian talking about this the other night. It plays out in reality. People truly, and as compassionate, right, as they can, as tragic as some of the stories are, risk their lives to get here.
Yeah.
And it's because there's something to offer.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not always the case. And what we have right now is
and our ancestors certainly did too, as well.
Right?
Yeah.
We have a rule right now that's blind. The rule cannot determine why someone wants to be here. That's the danger, because our rules should, as you said, we have these rules written on our hearts. And if someone does something and we say, look at them and say, you're a stinker, right? You're twisting stuff. You're being like this book, Laws as Harsh as Tigers. People come here and they would use that for human trafficking, or prostitution back in the day, back in the 1800s. And they were really concerned about that. So if we say someone's obeying the law, but they're a stinker, we want the law to be able to differentiate. And right now it cannot. And that suggests to me, on its face, it's not a good law. It's not a good view of the law, because the law should naturally let people self-select into what they're going to do by their own actions, not by us having to figure out what their intent is. That's a bad version of it.
Well, that's interesting. We'll definitely touch on more on that when we get the latter parts of this podcast. We'll talk about policy, because it just made me think of one question we'll have to talk about then too, is obviously when you're born here, you make no oath.
That's
As
right.
you said, you're not in a position mature enough to even make such a thing. So you're just born into this fealty, or in this case, jurisdiction, if we're going to use the Supreme Court's words. Yet should we rethink that and have, when you come of age, whether it's 18 or 21, whatever age you decide, obviously you probably have to be 18 because that's the age of voting. Do you want to be a citizen of this country? That's an interesting concept. Do you make that conscious decision? You want to commit to be here or not? So, because you're not giving that right now, you're it. And most people are fine with that. I mean, quite honestly. But let's keep going. So I think that the other part, so it all became around this, the 14th Amendment and the interpretation of whether being subject to the jurisdiction laws. And then if you read the 14th Amendment, obviously that got interpreted that there are certain people who may be inside the country, but for legal reasons, and some are obvious, some less obvious, they are not subject to the jurisdiction. One famous example would be a standing army. So, when the the British invaded in the War of 1812. They had soldiers on our soil. This was after we'd already achieved independence. In that sense, if one of them had, I don't know, brought along a wife or they had somebody there and they had a child there, they could argue, well, hold on, you were not, you're here as an invader. That's an easy example. Then you have the little more technical example of ambassadors, dignitaries who were here on as represented foreign ministers of their own government, who are only here to engage in commerce and or negotiations or geopolitical whatever. Um, and obviously they're here under that cloak of authority. And so we actually have rules to say they cannot be charged with different crimes and different things because of that stats. Now, that's a small group of people.
It is. It is. It's interesting you brought up the War of 1812 because one of the reasons that we went into that is that British ships were, and the term's called press ganging, but it's just making U.S. sailors saying that no, you're still British subjects because of this idea of fealty. Like you never were able to renounce your fealty to the British crown. And so their attitude was, well, we may have lost the American Revolution, but you're out on high seas. You still belong to England. You're going to go over there. And we fought that war on this issue. It was still, 250 years later, almost, 1812, still arguing about. That's really challenging that we haven't got it right. But they got it right. I agree with you. Before 1865, 1866, I think we had a right understanding. But now people look at that time period of our nation's history as like a new starting point, and it kind of cuts everything off at the knees. You don't know what the first principles are, and it'd be like getting a car and me asking you, how does the car work? How does combustion work? You're like, I just came into this transaction when I bought it. Don't ask me to engineer it, right? But in order to figure out what's wrong with the car, if something messes up, you have to go back to the people who made it, to figure that out going forward.
Yeah. So this decision was just so rich because it goes back to the founding of our country and the common law and how there was just this assumption. And so would you agree with me? I mean, I'm trying to summarize a little bit what they said in the decision, but also just kind of what you know about history. The reason nobody talked about citizenship and how you got it at birth is because that was assumed by everybody, because that's how it was in England. If you were born in England, you were subject to the crown, right away. And so there was no this concept, and they get into the decision that they talked about the difference between being blood and dirt, right?
Yeah,
which has this
Calvin's case.
Yeah,
they talked about in Blackstone. Those terms are jus soli, where soil from, and jus sanguinis, which if you exsanguinate means you bleed out. So based on your bloodline, or based on the soil you're born in. So soil can't consent to anything, right?
sure.
So I think that having your parents consent for you, I think is the best thing. It's the safest thing. It's the thing that most reflects the structure of society.
And so it's interesting a little bit. I will say I did not read as many of the pleadings and the before the decision was heard from the government or their amicus briefs, mainly because I just didn't want to. Well, some of it was a time issue, and honestly, I was, I'm a little bit. I probably should have, as a scholar, probably should have read a little bit more of that. But it's interesting to me that somewhat of their argument is like, well, no, it matters that your parents are citizens or that your parents were legally here, because now that's touching to the blood stuff.
Yeah.
And that was specifically what was rejected in the 14th Amendment. This idea that it's a little bit offensive to the idea of America. I mean, that's what we were kind of throwing off in our revolution, was this idea, because when you came from a country like England, pre-revolution, or during those times, your status was kind of impugned to you by your father or your mother, or what station, that word station. We don't even use that word anymore.
Dukes and duchesses.
Yeah. And so there are people who were born in low station, in other societies it's called a caste system. I mean, essentially that existed on some level. I wouldn't call it a caste system, but you couldn't escape. If you were born a poor son of a shoemaker, how are you going to become a duke? How are you going to become you're probably not. And so the people who escaped those, well, not just in England, but, from anywhere in Europe that were under the crown, because they were all at that time monarchies over there. They loved the idea of coming here and like, you could make your own life here.
Absolutely.
And you could get land. You might have to work, you might have to come into indentured service, but you had a pathway to a better life. You were no longer beholden to what your father or mother or your grandfather was. And that was the dream. And that dream exists to this day. There's nothing more amazing than meeting immigrants who come here with little but the clothes on their back. And decades later, they've established businesses. They've children who are going to become on the university, become doctors. That promise still holds true. And there's something divine in that. And we all feel it. Even if you can't even put a word on it, you're like, there's something special about that.
I think it is. God's word talks about us out in Jeremiah 29, and I got plans to bless you, plans to prosper you, or hope in the future. And I think that hope that we get that, it needs to be reflected in what we have, or at least provide the framework for that to rest upon. And right now, we use the term that reducing winners. I think that to interpret it as the cast, like you're inheriting this profession, you're inheriting those things, I think it doesn't line up with that, except for the adding political allegiance. The political allegiance would be passed from your parents. It wouldn't be a profession or, entitlement to some hereditary title, like the emoluments clause, right? Or the title clause. We don't have titles in the United States, but it was for your political allegiance. And I think that's where it has to follow from the parents. I think it necessarily does, because they're the ones who bring you into the world by God's grace. And then the next step, John Locke said, when a child is born, they're a subject of no country or government. He said that in section 118 of his second treatise. So if you're subject of no country or government,
I'm going to forbid you from quoting treatise sections. It just makes me look bad.
That's right. So when you do that, the parents are necessarily then conceding to the government after someone's born. Our child's political allegiance will be with this country until such time. And I like what you brought up a moment ago. At 18, they decide to do something to ratify it. And that's been English contract law for centuries, is that if you were 16 and a half and you went out and made a contract with someone who was foolish enough to let you sign the agreement, and you breached the agreement, you have two options. As a parent, you could say, sorry, you made the mistake and contracted with a minor. No one has to honor this whatsoever. Or two, as a parent, you could say, well, I morally feel bad, so I'm going to ratify this. And the parent could ratify it. The parent could all day long say, you know what, even though they're 16 and a half, we recognize this debt. And then it would shift, and that debt would become a debt of the parent. And that was the foundation of the family that tracked in English common law. But the family was the subgovernmental unit that preceded government. And so I think that makes sense to have it like that, because it honors those first principles throughout the duration.
Yeah. So I love that this decision walked through the history of this country and talked about how we brought the common law forth and how that was understood. I also thought it was fascinating how they touched on a couple of things. They touched on the Dred Scott decision.
Yeah.
Which, if you don't know your constitutional history and common law, was one of these horrible decisions, basically pre-Civil War, that said, oh, the descendants or children of slaves are not citizens, even if they're born here.
Yeah.
And so in essence, it's a tough position for the government. I know they probably wouldn't like me framing like this, that you're kind of trying to say, well, hold on, let's not totally dismiss some of those arguments from Dred Scott.
No.
Because there's sense that, you don't want to align yourself with Dred Scott if you can avoid it.
You don't want to be on that side of that.
And the other one, I thought, and this, of course, the Supreme Court's going to be very careful how they word things. They don't want to offend their colleagues. They're trying not to insult people. But the other case that was relied on and quoted on extensively in this decision was Wong Kim Ark. Now, you recognize just from that name, Wong Kim, that sounds Asian. And that was, right before the turn of the 19th century, so late 1800s. And we had some of it. You have a book here that I'm sure talked about this. Some of the most, surely racist, but restrictive and I don't want to say punitive, but restrictive was probably the best word. Laws against people. Chinese was the main focus, but essentially it was anybody Asian, because I think back in those days they didn't distinguish between Korean and Japanese, and to them they didn't want those people.
Yeah.
So there was all sorts of restrictive laws passed in that time. The Chinese Exclusion Act, one of them. And so this was, not an enlightened period of American, even though we did have lots of immigration coming from all over Europe and other places. This was still a time period very much where white men ran the show and had a say about who the kind of people they wanted to come here. And that decision even recognized that, well, no, this child born of an immigrant is a citizen.
Yeah.
So they're aligning themselves with two cases that are interesting because they're very clearly very racist periods of time. Dred Scott, without a doubt, and Wong Kim, different races, different people, but they're taking positions, and that's who the government aligned themselves with. And I say that, nothing's lazier to me than calling somebody a racist because that kind of shuts down the conversation real quick. But I wonder if that tracked with anybody inside the administration saying, "Hey, we're having to kind of align ourselves with some concepts, legal concepts here that we're not really I mean, especially looking back on them now, were very popular." I know they didn't try to. I'm not trying to imply that they were trying to revive Dred Scott or China exclusion stuff, but I mean, am I making sense here? Does this?
I understand what you're saying, and I think that they were looking at a procedural question in a let's look at Dred Scott case just on its face. One of the criticisms of that case, and I agree with this wholeheartedly, is the broader you make the attack against rights, the easier it is to prevail. So in Dred Scott, the person who wanted their slave back said, "You're attacking property rights." Well, who's going to disagree with that statement in a vacuum? Just isolated. You're attacking property rights. No, the narrow question that they got wrong was, do you have the right to own another person?
Yeah,
that was a narrow question. So they were saying procedurally, the states were saying, no, we have the right to make these state laws and you have to return state property. And so they were trying to answer the broader question. I think that's why it failed. We have civil war. Right?
Yeah.
Wong Kim Ark, interestingly, and this was really sad, and I appreciate you referencing the laws we had at the time. They had a law, we had an agreement with the Chinese emperor. And those people in the Wong Kim Ark case had done everything that you and I would say when we talked about the covenant to become American citizens. They had pronounced, we don't want anything to do with China, we want to be here. Of course, they were living free here. They weren't living in a feudalistic system under an emperor. They had done everything they could. And because of this agreement we had with China, we were saying, no, you can't be a citizen. It went up on that. And they said, no, the child is a citizen. They're permanent legal residents, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
right.
So I'm challenged by this case because I think that if you draw a broad conclusion, then it's not going to get to what the meat of it was and how it applies to citizenship. And I think the Supreme Court did that in those instances, didn't say, how does this directly apply to the question, the fundamental question, the preceding question of citizenship? Because Dred Scott, we needed those amendments. We truly did, because freed African slaves, if you want to take the 14th Amendment, say subject to political allegiance, by that time, because it was generational slavery, no one knew where their political allegiance was. So we had to do a positive act of law to establish you have political allegiance here.
Yeah.
So that drives the reason why it applied specifically to the failure of the Dred Scott case. And so then on the Wong Kim Ark, our bad laws, our statutory legal failures as documented across decades of history, said that these white male Europeans just didn't want someone who looked different. And that was a tragedy. That was a terrible tragedy, and it should have never happened. I don't think that then goes a step forward, because what it really says is that our decisions about you and your immutable characteristics, such as country of origin and ethnicity, are subject to a statute. And I think God's word tells us differently. God's word tells us, when you look at the story of Ruth, Ruth comes from Moab, enemies of Israel, going all the way back to Lot and Abraham. And Ruth instead says to Naomi, your people will be my people, your God will be my God. She completely adopts herself into the nation of Israel. And these people in Woken had done everything they could to do that. But it was this pernicious agreement that the U.S. had with the Emperor of China that they were going to let them become there. And that to me, like you said, it's a gut reaction. That seems wrong. It seems wrong that someone would want to disconnect themselves from a country, use that consent that the Declaration promises, and be stopped at the door. That just doesn't seem fair. So I think that's what we conclude from those. I think the Supreme Court used those in the wrong way.
Interesting. So they came out and essentially said, the decision that, as was ruled in Wonkin-Mark or honored in Wonkin-Mark, that the 14th Amendment did was really passed to settle this idea of citizenship at birth
Yeah.
for all time. And the argument from the government was like, no, they were just really addressing the freed slaves to make sure that was clear for
Yeah.
them. But again, the Supreme Court pointed to practice, they pointed to other decisions, and the fact that when they looked at a lot of stuff, it's comfort to me that they took a lot of time with this. And they looked at even things like debates on the floor while they were passing the amendments. And
the opinion's 194 pages.
yeah. And even I think it's fascinating too that if you look at some of the amicus stuff, I thought some people ought to point out, like, you have to remember some of these people were not, they themselves were children of immigrants. So to think that they would go and pass an amendment that would have probably excluded them or not settled the law.
Sure.
So I don't know. I mean, I think one of the things that troubled me very from the beginning when the Trump's executive order came out, first of all, is that this was not the proper process to pass laws and change laws is through legislation, through executive fiat.
Article 1.
I understand why he did it, because he realized, hey, I've got control of Congress and Senate for 2 years. I want to try to get as much stuff done as I can. I can at least appreciate the urgency and from a political expedient mind why they did the things. And I think, in his first administration, I think, he learned and his administration, people supporting him, learned a lot of how hard it is to do things when you're opposed. And so I think when they got back in the second time, they had a whole game plan that was just night and day different.
Lined up.
Yeah. And nobody saw it more on the front lines of immigration because of the way, and I say this in a weird way, somewhat, I don't want to say I respect it because I don't respect it, but it was impressive to me how they've attacked immigration in the last year and a half. They didn't do that the first 4 years. They've come at every policy that's favorable to immigrants almost to a T.
Yeah.
In a way it's diabolical. You're almost like, because I'm a board certified immigration lawyer. If you had hired me and said, Jeff, I want you to reverse engineer everything that we have that's favorable to immigrants, and just find a way to mess with it.
Yeah.
I mean, they came up with some really good stuff. Some of it was low hanging fruit, obvious, but some of it was like, wow, you're going after that. So, I don't know why I got on this little sidebar, but I think the point is, so it was very impressive to me that the Supreme Court took the weight of what was going on here. Like, we have to get this right, because, I mean, could you imagine had they ruled, if they found in favor and that this was an unsettled question of law?
Yeah.
Does that, I mean, one of the questions you have to ask is, well, then who's a citizen all of a sudden?
Yeah.
Because we don't literally have anything in statute. We have a lot of stuff about who gets naturalized or if you're born with citizens abroad. But there's nothing saying, there's no law saying if you're born in the United States, what else do you need to be a citizen? It was just you're born in the United States, you're a citizen.
And I like that.
So how far are we going to go back? They probably would have said like, well, no, starting today.
Starting today, right? And I think what's challenging to me, and I see exactly what you're saying, is they want to prune a tree they think is out of control, but they offer no solution on the other side. But this is human.
I'm sure they have solutions, Stephen.
Well, there's
they have a whole bunch of solutions.
I mean, the solutions. So if I say you say, and what's interesting about, because I think you have an amazing job in this, you're able to find where their laws, because their laws contradict, to my mind, God's eternal law and his natural law. The statute, because we're not supercomputers, we don't have the mind of God. We can't write bad statutes and close everything that's favorable to what we don't want. When we write a bad statute, it has bad spinoffs, but it also has gaping areas that allow stuff that the person writing the statute doesn't want to happen. And so when you're talking about all the areas that were favorable to immigrants, we've identified those through years of very good, solid immigration law practice to say, this is how you can see that this law allows X, Y, and Z. Sometimes it's a positive statement that's good, that's affirmative for people. Other ways, it's where the law doesn't say something and you're like, well, under English common law, we're free to do whatever the law doesn't prescribe. And so those are ways in which I think immigration, our immigration code, as terrible as it is, had good opportunities. And one of the premises of this book, Laws as Harsh as Tigers, is that when you really want something and you want to immigrate to the United States and you're in the 1800s or 1900s and you're from an Asian country, you're going to find the loopholes. You're going to find things that benefit you, and you're going to justifiably, and I don't say this in a negative sense at all, I mean in a very good positive sense, you're going to justifiably hold on to those with both hands as strong as you can, because there's something here that the other country didn't offer. And that was the freedom to come here, to have a full opportunity and rise by your merits and change your station in life. And that's something worth fighting for. It's something worth finding every way you can in the law to get here. It's completely justified. Yeah. Well, I think by them kind of making this decision, they've put a capstone on stuff that rests on shaky ground. And so I don't count them to stand, because the premises go back to,
I'm sorry, you don't count on what to stand.
this decision to me, because I think, to my mind, I think it's a good potential answer, but the wrong way to get there. And eventually when you play it all the way out, because it's not based on what I think is a biblical chain of thoughts, it might wind up at citizenship, which is fantastic, but because it's not a chain of thoughts based on first principles, there's going to be problems still. It's still butting up against what I think God's eternal law and natural law is, that about recognizing the image of God being visual and going about it the right way. Because God cares about both form and substance. He just snapped his fingers in Genesis 3 and all our sin would be gone. Jesus wouldn't have to die. He could done with that. But he had a path and a plan that was his divine plan. And it had a divine outcome and a good outcome. So I think both of those matter. So substance and form.
Well, that's interesting you say that. So you just to be clear, you feel like there might be some trouble for this decision down the road in the Supreme Court. Like they may, because I mean, it's a pretty, I mean, it's a 6-3 conservative to, although, you know, it's something a lot of people are ragging on Roberts these days.
Yeah.
It's as conservative court we've had in a long time.
Sure.
And I'm not saying it could get more conservative, but it's pretty conservative. You feel like that might, I mean, I don't think with the current court, they would probably go against it again.
Not with current court.
Okay.
It's going to have to, it'll be, to my mind, if I'm predicting the future, it will be one generation will do it. We looked approximately one generation with Roe v. Wade in the abortion decision, 1973, came out in January. Actually, I think the month I can see more October. So that took a generation, and they had to change the court, and they had to look at substantive due process, which this is kind of embedded in that, in the 14th Amendment. I'm sure we're going by the words of the 14th Amendment, but it's kind of a substantive due process. So it took a generation, and they changed the court, they changed the cycle, and they fed people into the court who thought differently. I think we're looking at that right here. Then another generation that's probably going to change.
That's interesting. So since they tried to do this through, you know, through the judiciary instead of through legislation.
Yeah.
Part of me thinks they're not going to want to come back to that tactic, but you're right. It's you know, never know. You never know how the court dynamics might change or the nature of public opinion. Because let's not be naive to think that public opinion can't affect judicial decisions.
Oh, it does.
I mean, it almost did on this one, quite honestly. Because I was actually shocked that it was. I mean, some people are calling it 5-4. I think it's really closer to 6-3 because the way Kavanaugh, if you read his dissent, he was saying first of all, you don't go around this with executives
orders. Yeah,
that was his
legislation.
Yeah. But then he was trying to coach. It seemed like, but if you try it this way,
it's almost like you get really a roadmap.
Yeah,
custom assault.
But you know, is there a possibility, or are we so divided as a country on the subject of immigration that there's no path? I mean, it's funny. I feel like if you could grab 100 people, like a swath of society, from far right wing to far left wing and everything in between, like just a true measure of society, and you put two guys like this in a room, and even maybe two more liberal versions of ourselves, we could get to a place with that 100 people where we could pass, you know, if we were an amendment or laws to change not only just immigration reform, but possibly even amend the Constitution. Because that's the real question to me is, and they pose that as like, this is a real problem in the dissents. They talk about the policy concerns of this. And they reference like not even Europe has birthright citizenship anymore. But I don't think there's any European country that still does birthright. So I get that. And I think that's, now that this has been decided, we can start shifting a little bit the policy conversation now. I think there is a conversation to be had there for sure. I don't feel like there's enough adults at the table right now, because you got on one side, I mean, and I think, you know, they may just say, well, you have to be a citizen. And the other side, I think sees as a potential danger. The Republicans always frame it as like, well, they just want future voters.
Sure.
That's a very simplistic form. I think what I don't like about that is to assume that just because you're an immigrant, that you would side with the Democrats. I think those are, I mean, I've met immigrants who are more conservative than I am.
Sure.
Um,
That's an interesting you call them political bedfellows, the phrase, because in the 1800s and the early 1900s, before the 1920s, the biggest opposition group to immigration were labor unions.
yeah, that makes sense.
But not now. I mean, it's weird because the Democrat Party is kind of an amalgamation of people who at their fundamental core might have different presuppositions about what they want to do. So labor unions really fought hard for those laws. I was, and it's tragic reading the history about how they were fighting against just someone wanting to come and have a job, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just wanted a job. Interestingly, prior to, I think it was 1966, passport applications in the U.S. ask you, what is the citizenship of your parent? What is this like your mom and your dad?
Mm-hmm.
Which is kind of interesting because if we're both our citizens, it doesn't matter, right? So and I think it's part of 1966, there weren't a lot of questions going on about people who are guest worker programs having kids here. There's no question they were on that, going to go back.
Yeah.
And so what we've done is we've tried to make a decision. Well, we thought the outcome was good, but I don't think the reasoning was good.
Well, I've long said, if you actually spend time talking to immigrants, not the politicians, not the people who say they speak on behalf of their immigrants, not even the immigrants' rights groups.
Sure.
Because you would think, oh, well, they must always voice. I'm shocked about how much immigrants themselves. I have so many clients that if you offer them today, I would say a green card, but forget a green card, just some kind of permit that allows them to be here, work, and travel back to their home country whenever they can. You don't have to call it a green card. You can call it whatever you want, like a renewable work permit. But it would never lead to citizenship.
Okay.
I dare say probably well north of 90% would take that deal, and they wouldn't even let me finish the sentence. They'd be like, done. What else?
What else?
And so what you're talking about, like historically, you have people asking more for the immigrants themselves are even asking.
Yeah. It's a confused question because we need to think about, why do people go places? You have famine, you have hunger, you have food exile or escapees. You have God saying, go this place, right? Many different reasons. And the reasons people want to come, it seemed like as I was a kid, I grew up the idyllic view of Ellis Island, right? And the Premier Huddle message, right? That idea of people showing up. And there's this big statue there, blazing with opportunity and promising opportunity. It really doesn't matter unless you want to do something bad. But right now we just don't know. And like you said, people coming here that are risking their life to get here, not that they're wanting to just have opportunity. And we don't have a real good way of categorizing that. Our interest, at least for me on the outside looking in to immigration law, right? I mean, I'm more of a policy guy. So I know some general laws, but I don't think we make that distinction unless we get into we try and, like a supercomputer, have like an alphabet soup of every reason someone wants to be here. I think it just boils down to 3 categories. You want to come here and make that covenant. If you want to come here and, like you said, 90% of people would just be a guest worker and would just submit that comment trying back and forth. Or you're visiting. Those are the only 3 categories I think that really matter. Because it doesn't matter if you're a worker, what your work program is. You want to come here and work, you want to make money.
Yeah.
Either you're a covenant or you're making money.
I think so many, it's the money. I mean, it's obviously the number one reason for everybody.
Sure.
I mean, it's interesting. You just didn't read we're in the midst of the World Cup and you read all these blogs and these videos, Instagram reels of immigrants visiting here for the World Cup. And if you had one theme, I'm sure you follow this, so they're a little bit of a fan.
They're funny.
Yeah, they're funny, but I think the one thing through all of them is the blown away by the abundance.
That is tremendous.
And these are not people from third world countries.
No,
they're coming from Europe, and they're like, dude, we sat down and they gave us free shit. We didn't even ask for shit. Like, well, we won't pay for this. And like, no, it's on the house. The same with the refills and all these kind of, and of course they go to stores and they're like, I can't believe there's a selection. So I mean, that's the number one reason when you come from somewhere where you don't have those choices, that is terribly enticing. We've all been to I don't care if you're from the kid from the small village, you go to the big city,
Yeah.
you just get overwhelmed by like the choices, the options. And then that just seems like, especially in an environment of freedom,
Mhm.
my options are unlimited here. That's what you start thinking.
Bounty. It's the bounty. Matt, we're in the church from the book of Matthew, talking about God brings rain on the righteous and unrighteous. When he happens, the natural blessing to fall that he does, it overflows, not just in a linear way where, like good spy, bad spy does something and it's -5, and then God, the good spy, brings you to +5. No, it's like bad spy is -5 and God's like +1,000,000. You benefit so much when you do things his way. And when our country was founded his way and founded on eternal principles, the image of God in people,
Yeah.
private property rights, the rule of law, having open courts, all those things. People come here and they want to earn money. Why? Because back home, there's going to be 3 layers of people stealing from them before they get back to the house. I guess want a place where I can be safe. I want a place where I can earn money. My family's going to be protected. I'll do whatever I can for that. And that to me, it matters. It matters because God put those desires in us, those desires for safety and security and that blessing of the future. And if we get laws that reflect that, then that's a perfect marriage.
Yeah. We try not to get too political on the show, but it's tough because when you're in immigration, it's just
it's
a political question.
Yeah,
there's
it
two.
is.
It's a spectrum, and obviously you can get right or left anywhere in between that. The current administration currently unabashedly is proud of the fact they're trying to limit immigration. They're trying to deport as many people, whether they're undocumented or undesirables. They're trying to undo naturalizations.
Sure.
So clearly, and if you listen to the talking heads, both inside the administration or just their mouthpieces in the media and different talk shows and all those kind of things, podcasts, there's clearly a spirit there. I've seen two things. One is, and this kind of starts with the America First thing. So I want to speak of this in terms of through a biblical lens that I think is it's like a lack of understanding, or it's not aligned with what God's word said. It's a scarcity mindset.
Yes.
So when you say first, mine first, there's a sense there, like a kid, right? Me first. It's mine. I don't want to share. We've got all this stuff here. It's good. Let's put up walls.
Yeah.
We're going to take care of our people. And then maybe at the end, we'll do that. Now, I'm not saying there's not some smart biblical principles could be taken from that, because obviously if you're spending money you don't have, that's not biblical. If you are foolish, what you've been entrusted with, if you're not a good steward, that's not biblical. So I'm not saying it's devoid of any biblical principles.
Yeah.
But there's also this mindset of, so the scarcity of there's not enough to go around.
Sure.
So we better hoard what we got and be careful when we get it. And whether that came from like cutting programs like USAID or other institutions, whether they're NGOs or government that were giving a lot of help to poor people, not just in the United States and outside, that sends a signal of like, well, what's going on here? And the second thing is this idea of who we want to come in and be a part of this experiment. There's a mindset that there's certain people who are not aligned with us culturally.
Yeah.
And culture is an interesting word because, look, you've been in organizations, you've run your own organizations, you've been in leadership, obviously in the Navy. Culture's huge. There's so many books written about culture. And I think we don't talk enough about, we talk a ton about culture inside of organizations, businesses or teams or whatever you know, but you can't talk about it in respect to countries.
To people.
Well, because it gets sensitive, like, well, now are you judging those people or are you judging them? Because it turns to race really quick, which I think is weird because culture has nothing to do with race.
It's word proxy. Yeah, the color skin has no idea what traditions you hold.
Yeah. That's why you can literally bring anybody of any race into your company and they can align with your culture.
That's right.
So, but anyways, so I think that's this misunderstanding that, and what I've heard from the talking head and the proxies for the government, for the administration is that, well, Western, we're more interested in people who are aligned with Western cultures coming out of, obviously the Roman and Greek traditions in Europe. And these are, everything that was established ended up in the common law and a way, of course, I put my kid through, a classical education, which they talk about these features of open debate and decided respect for the law. And these are great things. My problem is not that's not a conversation you should have. It's my problem with it is this underlying assumption that if you come from Mexico
Yeah.
or Honduras or Ethiopia or India or Pakistan, by nature, you're not culturally aligned. So let's talk on those two things, the idea of scarcity and the idea of culture and how that's driving some of the policies right now.
Yeah, I think the idea of scarcity. I always been challenged by that. The idea of Malthus, was it Thomas Malthus? Malthusian scarcity, like there's not enough to go around.
Mm-hmm.
There's a parliamentary experiment where economists said the population bomb, right?
Smile.
Where Ehrlich had this population bomb books. By the year 2000, we're going to be in a kind of like a Hunger Games type society. And so this accountant bet him over 10 years. He said, we're gonna bet on the cost of raw materials over 10 years. I bet the price is gonna go down. It was a 10-year wager. It's called the
Malthusian wager.
It's the Ehrlich wager.
Okay, the Ehrlich.
If you look it up, and
I think I've heard of this.
He bet him, and it wound up the price of everything went down. And he let the other guy $10,000 over 10 years. He said, you pick the 10 commodity, the 10 raw materials, and the price all went down. And he said, well, our world was abundant. But what we do is we wind up making decisions, poor decisions that cause that. You look in these countries around the world, the famine in Ethiopia, primarily caused by the government, right? Mm-hmm. Making bad decisions. And so I think we have.
Well, that's the idea of communism in the social. Well, I don't know if that's the idea of it, but this idea that if somebody is wealthy, they have what should be shared amongst all of us. Like it's impossible to have somebody who's wealthy. And somebody else could also achieve wealth because by nature, to that person to achieve their wealth, they must take from the other wealthy guys.
It's this false zero-sum game. Yeah. Right. And what we find is that like your prosperity actually helps me be prosperous.
Yeah.
And so that mutual trade, that mutual consent requires us, interestingly, to get past our selfishness, because in a God-honoring transaction, I part with, like, say, a pen, right? I sell you this pen for what I think is a fair market price. In a place where the rule of law is it, and we have open markets, you give money for me for what you think is a fair price, and I both prosper. You get this, and I get the money. I want to make some more. So I think scarcity drives it.
Well, I always have that question for people who think like that is like, who? Because it's easy to say if you inherited wealth or you were the son of a business magnate or something like that. Okay, then that's how I don't have the rich father to inherit from. Therefore, that's not fair. But I'm like, well, who did Bill Gates get his billions from? Who did Mark Zuckerberg get his billions, or Elon Musk, right? These are guys that did not grow up wealthy. And yet now they're the wealthiest men in the world.
What about inherited talent, right?
Well, that's
I'm a musician either. Yeah, exactly. That's not fair. I'm a musician. My youngest son has won awards for singing, right? But he's developed that talent. He got some raw material from me. He got some raw material from his mom genetically, but he's pushed that further. So I think that we have to not look at it in this is mine and kind of grabbing and understanding abundance. And the other piece, you were saying scarcity, but the other one?
It's culture.
Culture, yeah.
So how these two things are driving, because scarcity usually is a leftist policy when it comes to, like, we need to tax higher.
Yeah.
And we need to share, corporations need to do this, X, Y, and Z. And so it's interesting. You're hearing those same arguments be cited for the reasons of shutting down, because they're taking our jobs, right? Which is interesting, because there's a statistic out there that's a couple years old now that half the Fortune 500 was started by immigrants. So I'm like, they're creating jobs. I mean, look at Elon Musk. How many jobs did that dude create?
Created a ton of jobs. And the idea,
I mean, when SpaceX went public, I read that he created, just in Austin, more multimillionaires that had ever been, like, in one day. And that's just in Austin.
And he's an immigrant, right?
Yeah.
So, the thing that drives that job market, minimum wage, that's typically a left of center political policy that excludes people from the workforce. And so then we have to drive this false notion where someone's desperate for work, but yet you can employ them, which is against, to me, I think the ability to work is a natural right that God gave you. So why would you say it's illegal to employ that person? I think you should be able to employ them for whatever the market will bear on that. So it is, the scare is a bit challenging. Culture, it was really interesting to me. We moved to a new house May of last year, and the tree from my neighbor was growing over, and it was an interesting conversation because I'm not my neighbor, and someone might say this, right? Your neighbor's different ethnicity. What are they gonna feel about who's gonna get to cut the tree? And I just wanted to say, hey, I'm like, hey, we got this tree. It's grown over. It's kind of hanging in my yard. And he's like, yeah, just cut off the limbs of our yard. That's what the law is. And he was just totally sold out about what the tree law was. And me being a lawyer, I already looked it up. And I was like, great. He like he would agree with me so much. And other
Mhm.
people may have said, oh man, be suspicious of his ethnicity. He's going to try and pull one over on you. But it was not that experience at all. And I wasn't expecting that. I just want to have a direct
Mhm.
conversation with him to see what we were going to do about this tree that's right on the boundary on it. And it was a beautiful conversation. As a matter of fact, I think we have this big mix within like 6 or 7 houses, like 6 or 7 different, cultural backgrounds and ethnicities, so it's wonderful.
That's
It's all
all.
moved.
Well, I think, and continuing on the conversation of policy, so to be aligned with God's word, I'm troubled with how my brothers in Christ and sisters in Christ right now who are more right of center on this issue.
Yeah.
Um, and I don't know all these people. I don't get to have conversations. You see people online and read things, you hear different groups, but there clearly is this mindset um, that I feel just is in straight violation of so many biblical principles. And the first one I think of always is the who is my neighbor.
Yeah.
When you're talking about the parable of the Good Samaritan, and this idea that there's value. I mean, there's a call, I should say, on all of us to treat people a certain way, regardless
Sure.
of their obviously who they are, where they are from there. It was just the number one thing, and I feel like we're a little bit like the guys walking by,
We do
the
see
guy on the side of the road, and we justify it by saying, well. We all do this. I mean, I'm not picking on a guy. I can do it as well as anybody. I'm not saying I've mastered this, but this idea that, like, well, maybe he had that coming. And I think that with immigration, there's a little bit of this, like, well, they're getting deported. Maybe they had it coming. They broke the law. They need to pay the price.
yeah.
And it's really this kind of older brother mentality. Kind of, these are the two, another parable, right? The prodigal son. And we don't like to think of ourselves. We always like to think of ourselves as the prodigal son coming home to God and the Father who's forgiving us and accepting us. But how often are we the older brother bothered by the fact that, hey, younger brother got away with all this stuff,
Yeah.
and now he's getting rewards?
Well, and
That just seems unfair, right?
it
And so
does.
it's the same as the other. I'm forgetting the names of the stories, but the workers, the same workers being paid the same wage as
Yeah.
the guy who's been working all day who
The
came
day
in the last
laborers.
time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Laborers.
it's this idea so there's this fundamental thought of Americans that that's unfair.
Mm.
Goes back to what we were talking about earlier that we learned that is somewhat true. There's a biblical principle about being fair and just. Yet God calls us to be very graceful and loving in a way that's so tough for us to wrestle. And we love it when it's applied to us, but we just wrestle with that. So speak to your thoughts on that.
And I like these verses in the Bible where it says God loves the sojourner. That to me is powerful. Uh, when we think about that, we think about the Good Samaritan. The guy was in dire life and death need of medical care, and so he picked it up, and that was a challenge to them. They defined people by their country of origin. That was a Samaritan, and so a self-respecting Jew wouldn't go have that Samaritan, and that's a real challenge. Back in the 50s and 60s, this ties with so many interferences, I think, of the government with how we just naturally live. You used to have mutual aid societies. It would be it would be nonprofit organization, Koreans of Austin for Koreans, and you would have, instead of having what I think is what 60+% of their GDP spent on like social welfare programs, you would have Koreans of Austin for Koreans, and they would go there. If you were Korean, you'd immigrated from Korea, you would have people there that could help you get a job. They could help you navigate everything you're doing. And they could take care of if you were just staying around waiting for everybody to just wait on you and you had no gumption, they could kick you in the pants and say, get to work. And they could evaluate, what I would think would be a proper cultural mix. One of the interesting things that was occurring to me as I was doing immigration research regarding the Golden Door has that in there, is Asian immigrants would be business owners here. And one of the rules they had crept up in the 1800s, early 1900s, was you could go away and you could come back and you could still be considered a citizen if you had a business that you could prove it was yours. Yes. And the typical Asian model for a business name was like Lucky Star or some some moniker that had goodwill in it. In the U.S. business, there were always like Smith and Sons or Joe Smith's Mercantile.
Yeah.
And so they would culturally make a distinction there that shouldn't exist. A cultural distinction about a Chinese way of making business versus a Western European way of making business. And
Yeah.
so, but both of them wanted the rule of law. Both of them want to do that, but they were like, we don't want your kind here. And they would use those things to exclude people. It just blew my mind. They weren't looking out for the sojourner. They weren't looking out. The Bible calls it the ger, for the person who's a foreigner, a stranger in kind of Old Testament material. They also had guest workers in the Old Testament. You read King David bringing in guest workers from Tyre and Sidon, and Solomon bringing them to help build a temple,
Yeah.
stuff like that. So there were distinctions there, but when you came to issues of life and I would say weightier matters, God told you to look out for the sojourner to take care of them.
Yeah.
And I think we need to go a long way before we're reflecting that in our day to day.
Yeah. I have this, I actually got it from a previous person who put together 40 Bible verses that talk about God's heart towards immigrants. And
I think you sent me that. Right?
Yeah, and there's so many that if I tell you what, if you read all those and you come away with the one thought that God really has a heart for widows, orphans, and sojourners or immigrants, and to go against any one of those three, man, I don't want to be that guy.
No, because God loves them, and you're challenging what God loves.
Yeah, and so I'm just troubled that not more believers are embracing. Well, I think a lot of believers will embrace the widow and the orphan. It seems like, but why do you think we struggle? And I hate to cast the pall of the entire church, because I mean I know there's people off the political spectrum when it comes to this stuff. But do you see that a lot? I mean, because you walk in similar halls as I do, I think. And I know there's different denominations that would probably, typically you'd say Baptist is probably more Republican, say a Methodist church. So, but why do you think there's some churches that struggle a little bit more with this idea of illegal immigration and seeing them as sojourners instead of seeing them as law? Because they see them as lawbreakers.
Yeah, they see them as lawbreakers.
And I would say first, they might be, they're sojourners, but they're a lawbreaker.
Yeah, and that's secondary.
And then they'll go to Romans. Yeah.
That's
you got to obey the law of the land.
I agree with you. There's dissonance there. The first and foundational thing is the image of God. They're made in the image of day. God says he loves them. So we need to have in our mind, in our framework, in the way that we approach society, a mechanism that we voluntarily engage in to love on them. And if you don't have that space in your heart, then that space is being filled up by you and not by God. That there needs to be that.
Or even something worse than that. Yeah.
Yeah. The church as a whole stepping up to do that. But being a follower of Christ isn't moral. It's following a set of moral rules plus church attendance. It's behavior transformation. It's positively affecting society. If you were to get sucked up and your congregation sucked up, is there a vacuum? Do people know that you're not there? Why? Because the people that were serving me, these are people that were loving on me. And that makes a difference in people's lives. They have that felt need met. And if you're helping them out, I mean, I think it would be beautiful for like a church turn over the immigration law practice and say, hey, we want to support these people as they're trying to assimilate. That matters. And that's where the road meets the road. Jesus said this, you were thirsty, you're hungry, you're in prison or sick or something. And I fed you or gave you water. I visited you and took care of me. He's like, that's the mark of the gospel.
Yeah.
True religion is this. Carry forth from those.
Well, would you agree or disagree? When I read, when Paul's writing, he says there is no Greek, there is no slave. He's talking about these distinctions that we tend to put on ourselves.
Yeah,
in society. Would a modern Paul say there is no illegal or legal? Would he say that, or is that just a bridge too far?
I think that he would say.
Because essentially, I thought about this and I was like, well, slave was illegal.
Yeah. When I'm doing an act of charity, there is no illegal versus legal. When I'm doing an act of charity, when I'm serving someone, I'm giving someone food, I'm helping them do something, there is no legal illegal. I think that, I have such a challenging this because our laws don't reflect, I think, God's natural law or his eternal law when we're dealing with ignorant. I think we're so far afield, we have to unpiece it, kind of like a herringbone necklace, and it gets all twisted, and you have to lay it out and kind of smash it flat so you can see what it's supposed to be like original.
Or just throw it away and buy it.
Yeah, throw it away, right? Throw it away. We're like 250 years past.
That's what we do with our law. We just have to throw it away. And
That's right. Or go to Supreme Court. That's actually something no one's talked about yet. When, we have these kind of 50 laboratories of liberty in the United States, 50 states. It used to be, and history repeats itself. There's nothing new under the sun. In 73, when Roe was passed, that meant that every case that involved abortion was going to be resolved at the U.S. Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what we've just done is
we point it back to the laboratory.
Well, yeah. So what?
I'm sorry, jumped off. That's not what you're going to say.
No, you're going. So yeah, because the U.S. Supreme Court said, okay, we're going to send it back to the states. What we've made now is that every immigration case now is going to get resolved at the U.S. Supreme Court. Every single one, because they've said that. But now, how many questions are unanswered by this decision?
That is a good question.
A lot of questions aren't answered. So what would they did just went at once and just created, dozens of more unanswered questions that are going to have to get resolved at the U.S. Supreme Court. It's definitely going to increase your workload. It's going to increase the, I think, the potential people coming in immigration law, because now you got to reconcile this decision with all the links in the chain that have been messed up all the way back to the amount of day in the Declaration. That's my opinion.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, in some sense, I feel like it provided clarity and ended this thing, at least for now. Like you said, maybe another court take a crack at it down the road, but another generation. So I at least feel like at least the chatter about this idea, because it was weird. I think like within a couple of days of this decision, was it Trump himself who was challenging states not to give birth certificates?
Sure. I mean,
and I was like, well, that seems like a complete violation of what the Supreme Court is.
It is. Supremacy clause is going to dominate that.
Yeah. So when you said it raises more questions, like which question would it raise? I think, citizenship is a tough one just like in Europe, where you have the European Union and people go. So, I mean, they're basically trying to create their own states, if you will, in the sense of being able to economically and touristically, I don't know, travel wise, be able to move freely, right?
Yeah.
Free movement of goods and people. I mean, is that a concept? I think first, do we still really embrace that in this country, this idea of free concept of movement of people? Because I think we did for a long time. And I think that's another problem with American First. It doesn't feel welcome to people. And if you talk to a lot of immigrants right now, that is what they will tell you. I don't feel welcome there.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about just the ones who are getting deported.
Yeah.
I've had clients who are permanent residents, or people like, just recently, another executive order on May 21st saying, we're going to make all people go home to get their green card. Like, so there's this process called adjustment of status.
Okay.
If you, let's say you're an immigrant, you come in on a visa and you marry a U.S. citizen, before you just file your paperwork and you get your green card here.
Yeah.
And they said, well, that was an act of extraordinary grace.
Okay.
Which is ridiculous because it was just part of the law. Maybe you could argue it's graceful, but it's just there in the law. And so they've walked that back a little bit. But this idea that it just makes people feel like, why can't I the law says I can, why are you making me do? So when you become a society, you start sending images to those who, whether they're visitors or not, temporary or permanently, that they don't really want me here.
It's punitive to make someone do that. That's where we have gone the wrong way on our view of the human being and what they need and what's convenient and right and just. That's not just to interpret it that way. That's punitive the way they're doing that, because they don't like the fact that the system is broken. And so they're going to take their anger out and use a distorted system, and you're going to get a distorted view. And so when someone's interacting with that system, they're getting a distorted view of what freedom looks like, because this improperly defaced tool of the immigration code, as it is right now, is presenting a terrible picture of what freedom means.
Yeah.
It's presenting a terrible picture.
Or the pursuit of happiness.
Well, pursuit of happiness, right? If you think about this, because of these, I always think it was kind of concentric umbrellas, like a nesting doll. right?
Yeah.
My wife loves those nesting dolls. So you got this largest nesting doll is God's eternal law. And then underneath that, you have what he's revealed to Christians. This
Hmm.
underneath that. Underneath that is natural law because it gives rain to the righteous and the unrighteous. And so, and then inside of that is statutory law. The immigration code is a bunch of statutory law
Hmm.
that conflicts with natural law, in my opinion, conflicts with what's revealed to us and conflicts with God's eternal law. And so you're going to have it just banging and banging and banging away against those boundaries that it's supposed to honor and recognize. And then people on the receiving end who are coming here looking for freedom, it's going to be unrecognizable. It's
Hmm.
not going to be a blessing. It's not going to be nice. It's not going to be kind. It's not going to be favorable for what they really want to do, which is pursue freedom.
So what's this? I mean, let's talk about the path forward because that's always, I mean, if there is one. And I know if you and I were made dictators for a day, we could probably come up with a pretty good system that pretty much honored God's law and actually made a little bit of common sense. And
Yeah.
both had, not rampant, just anybody can come here and just, overwhelm society, but also not, the punitive and the heart behind the laws were
Yeah.
reflecting God's heart. How do we do that knowing that we have a polarized society right now who can't agree hardly on anything? All right. There's very few things bills our Congress can pass these days that receives joint support. And so I have a feeling if somebody tried to pass it right now, um, I know that they had this Gang of Eight back in 2008 and Bush's last year that was trying to pass comprehensive immigration reform. And I think it was half Republican, half Democrat. And that was lot less conflictive time. And they couldn't even get it passed then.
Sure.
We're far removed from that. So what is the step forward to having this conversation and bringing people together? And I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. When I look at that and I go back to one of the principles that I read Ecclesiastes one chapter a day, every single day. So I've seen that a
Seeking
lot.
out wisdom.
I've seen it a lot. There's nothing under the sun. So I say, well, what did society do whenever they thought the rights of the unborn were being challenged? They, in a very programmatic way, sought to educate people, to use their shoe leather to persuade people, to actually start, even when people were in college and law school, to influence their thinking, their decision making on this, to take those people then and get them to become judges and to become lawmakers and to move policy directions that way. I think we need to do the same thing for immigration law. We need to say, this is where it starts out. Here's the image of God. Here's how we honor that. Here's maybe a model set immigration law that we can all agree to, and reduce it probably by like, I don't think a 50th of maybe what it is.
Mhm.
It'd be very simple and straightforward. And it would conform to natural law. So I think people would say, oh, I could accept that because it would address the front end, address everybody's fears in the front end. And of course, you're going to have you said a spectrum of people, how they deal with it. There's going to be people that are xenophobic no matter what you do.
Sure.
Well, so we're not talking about the separate ends of the bell curve because there'll be someone that says, I don't even want any national
Yeah,
boundary.
ignore the extremes.
The
Focus on
On the middle, you're going to say, these are going to be with you in a natural way that you're going to be able to accept because you're going to see the fairness of it. But it's going to be a journey. And so right now, we have to commit to the journey and commit to a long-term plan to persuade people of the righteousness of the cause, the humanity of the sojourner, the problems that we've had all the way up to now, starting from our earliest immigration laws in the 1800s, Chinese Exclusion Act, all that stuff, all the way forward. Why it was wrong, and how to and present them a model and alternative. Because complaining about the problem without an alternative doesn't matter.
Of course, yeah, you have to come with some ideas.
Yeah, Trump's executive order was a complaint without an alternative. Really, it just didn't give anything, and it said, you bad. That doesn't make any sense. So,
So I mean, by just how you're explaining, though, you're implying, well, not implying, you're flat out saying the church almost believers have to lead on this.
Yes, absolutely. We have to say it. I mean,
Why is the church not willing? And I say the church, I'm talking really about pastors who lead their churches. And I mean, I guess elders, depending on your denomination and how you biblically are aligned with how you set up your church. I guess elders are really the leaders, but I don't feel like that's happening in a lot of places. And so I don't disagree with you. I would love to see the church lead this thing.
Yeah.
I just feel like why is there this disconnect?
there's an element. So you look at the church over the centuries, there were, I guess, movements and countermovements. You had the fundamentalists were reacting to the humanists. So you had the fundamentalist in church. So, well, yes, you can tell us all the miracles, except we're going to cling to these. The virgin birth, God's creation of man, the crucifixion, essentially these obvious miracles. We're going to cling to those fundamental things. And then that became very rancorous to the pietist movements. Like, oh, don't worry about it. I don't want to get involved. I'm just sitting here, I'm claiming to pray, right? And then that would create a vacuum in policy. So you had people, a lot of ungodly people in policy. Charismatic response to pietist movement. The church right now doesn't get involved in those conversations. And to my mind, like Abraham Kuyper, great theologian, said there's nothing in the world over which the sovereign God doesn't say this is mine. So
Yeah.
be afraid of that conversation. And number one, or to say it's awkward. I, I can guarantee you, every lawyer that I've ever talked to, their first case they ever had in court felt awkward. Why? Because it was unexplored, because you did not have the conversation before. But if you have a conversation over and over again, it becomes less awkward.
Yeah.
And if we believe in the righteousness of it, the Holy Spirit will give us, to my mind, the words to say at the right time, which, as the Bible said, will be apples of gold and stones of silver, to persuade people. But we have to be involved, and we can't say there's something in the world where the church can't be. That's retreating. I love the hymn, "This is my Father's world," and everything in here belongs to my Father. So if I'm going to represent my Father well, I need to speak His truth in any situation I come into, not shy away from them, thinking I'm being tainted by the world. Because what Jesus said is that we actually make things holy by engaging in them. And he said that. He was talking about you're not defiled by what comes into your body. He was talking about eating and washing the dishes. What comes out of your mouth is what defiles you. And the things in your heart defile you. And the mouth speaks from the overflow of the heart. So I think we need to engage in the issue, not be afraid to do it.
Yeah. Amen to that. Well, anything else you want to say about this? We've been going on for a good hour and a half, but I've loved every second of it. I could keep going because I have such a heart for, my world for whatever. And it's funny how you get involved. Like, if you would have told 17-year-old me, hey, you're going to be involved with immigrants every day of your life, I would have been like, you're crazy. Like, cause that was not my world. I grew up in a middle class, very white. I didn't speak any languages. I don't even know if I know any immigrants at the time. I don't think I did.
Mhm.
In fact, the first immigrant I can actually remember saying I met was my senior year of high school. There was a missionary who was on furlough.
Okay.
And God blessed me by this guy came into my life. He was a gringo. He was a white guy.
Mhm.
Grew up here in Austin, but he had gone to Thailand. And
Okay.
so he ended up marrying a local woman there. And so they got married and technically they immigrated back. I don't know if they really immigrated because he went back and lived in Thailand for another 30 years. And still, I think principally lives there with his wife and then he's some of their kids. But he invited me to a Bible study. And so I got to meet this woman from Thailand and eat Thai food for the first time in my life. And that's really the first time my eyes started opening. But I didn't even, 18-year-old Jeff's not thinking about like, oh, how hard was it for you to get a visa? And
Yeah.
do you feel welcome here? I was not on my radar. And I just assumed, that like, oh, there was a way for people to get here.
Sure.
And there still is. I'm not trying to say that our immigration laws are completely broken down, but what I've found in these years is that believers generally have huge hearts for immigrants when they know those immigrants.
That's how it happened to me. When my wife's uncles experienced their challenge of coming here, of being embedded in Toronto and then getting the signal and can come, and only one of them did, and then the others, they just stayed there. It's like it would be like being engaged to someone for 20 years,
Yeah.
and you held out, and they're finally like, oh, "I'm gonna marry you." You're like, "Sorry, that ship has sailed."
Yeah.
And that just a disappointment.
Your courting process is a little slow.
It's a little slow. That's right. And going back to the idea of marriage and a covenant, we have a lot of different covenants in life. Obviously, our highest covenant is the Lord, right?
Mm-hmm.
The marriage covenant and the covenants we make, the allegiances we make, they matter.
Mm-hmm.
They matter, and they need to be aligned with God's purposes. And so until we see this, to my mind, see a political allegiance as a covenant that needs to align with all of God's other purposes he gives us in his word, then we're going to be skewed. We might start off at the same airport, but our destination airport is going to be wildly different.
Yeah. Well, and then that same things I've seen, I've had elders from churches in the last month or two call and say, "Oh, my housekeeper's husband was detained. I want to help him." And so that's what I'm saying. The generosity I see from believers who probably, if I had to guess, voted Republican in the last, several elections.
Yeah.
Will that change on one issue? I don't know. I worry that there's not enough people who are proximate to immigrants on the right to really because I most of my conversations I can tell almost with eyes glazed over.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, this is not my problem.
Sure.
Which again, that's very problematic because that's the attitude the same guy is walking by and the Good Samaritan walking by the guy's side. It's like, no, it's not my problem.
Sure.
Well, he might have deserved that. He could be a thief. He could be a drug dealer.
Yeah,
I don't know. Yeah.
More about them. I don't want to be unclean, right?
So I want to believe it. You're right. To me, it's going to be a God thing. If this thing is able, if believers first of all willing to be bold enough to speak up about it, and moving the Spirit will move the hearts inside the churches to say, even though I'm not proximate, I'm going to wake up to this. Right? Maybe in some ways, and again, I'm not trying to over dramatize this or make anybody feel really bad, but I wonder, like, if I was alive in 1950. And I was an 18 to whatever, well, probably an adult, young adult. And I'm living in my side of the town and my kids are going to school and we're just having a nice old life, good old classic American life. And somebody wanted to talk to me about how bad that school over there on the other side of town, the other side of the railroad tracks is. And I'm thinking, well, my kids don't go there, and, oh, that's the black school. Well, I mean, yeah, that sounds horrible, but that seems complicated because there's a lot of things probably went into there. The law says technically they can't go. You know what I'm saying? So you can hide behind the law. You can have like a little bit of cognitive dissonance. Well, I mean, they broke the law, so
yeah.
I don't know, man. I would love to let you close us out on your thoughts on what can the average believer who's just of the dozens of people listen to this. No, this will go viral. But if somebody were to hear this and say, "Well, I don't want to be I don't want to be the Pharisee who walks behind. I want to be more like the Samaritan who helps him out. I want to be more like, somebody who has a compassionate heart and is not going to sit back." What's their move for that? What's their step?
I think their move is to, in their church, meet that out because people from all cultures are visiting all types of churches. And see someone who's on the outside, who's the Gare, who immigrated, who might be trying to get, like working with you, trying to get their status identified and fixed and see, how can I serve you?
Yeah.
It's washing their feet. That movie that came out, the Jesus Revolution.
Yeah.
Movie where the old guard of the church is so concerned about their staining the shed carpet. And so the pastor was like, "Oh, I got to wash their feet. Then I'm gonna serve them in a way that's tangible." It created a revolution of love.
Yeah.
So if we lead with love, and loving people on all sides of it, saying, I remember when I was in seventh grade, and my dad was foreman in a construction company, and I'd come home, was repeating ethnic joke that I had heard, and he got very, very upset at me. There's one thing I learned from. And I said, the people who might working for an immigrants work harder than anyone.
Yeah.
And it shocked me. And I would say that was the day out of a cultural mix in just Southwest Houston that my ethnic blindness,
the scales fell off.
The scales fell off from my eyes. And I started to think about the world around me. We need to think about the world around us. See, the church starts to do that and starts to be, the Essenes were great. They thought they had great doctrine and then disappeared because they don't multiply. The church didn't multiply. No, it does. There are people who are in need, who see your love and your generosity, and they say there's something to that. And you say, "Oh, yes, I'm helping you for a bigger reason because God loves you. He wants an eternal relationship with you, and I can invite you into that act of generosity."
That was well said, my friend. Well, Stephen Casey, great lawyer, man after God's own heart, good friend. And I love his, honestly, I love his scholarship on this because, in some ways you don't have any necessarily work reason to get involved in this or pursue it. But I think there's something about it. I think God's put it on your heart. It could be just a simple fact that your wife's family is from the Philippines, or it could be that you're around this and you see the injustice. But I love the fact that you are arming yourself not just with God's words, but everything out there to being very knowledgeable. I think you're a voice for the times, and I'm glad to have you on this podcast, my friend.
Well, it's been an honor. Thanks so much.
Yeah. All right. We'll see you next time. Well done, my friend.